I want to preface it with a little story. Greg Creech, whom I've mentioned, he's the guy who wrote the book on Nican that I've referred to quite a bit through this program, and he runs the Toto Institute in Vermont, which is a school for Japanese psychotherapy and that sort of thing. And he sends out a newsletter periodically. And so one year I got this newsletter, and it was telling the story of this boy who didn't speak. And he was completely normal in every way. He was of the age where he should have been speaking in complete sentences and all that kind of stuff, but he had never talked. And so his parents were very concerned about this. So they took him to a whole lot of doctors and specialists of every kind and all that kind of stuff, and they checked him out, gave him a complete, clean bill of health. Nothing wrong with him whatsoever. He just didn't talk. So one morning, his mom was making breakfast for him, and he was sitting at the kitchen table. She put his food down in front of him, and he looked down at his plate. He looked up at his mom, and he said, "Hey, you burned the toast." Well, his mom was thrilled. I mean, here's her son who had never spoken, and now he's talking, and so she picks him up, and she hugs him, and she kisses him, and she twirls him around the kitchen and everything, and when the initial thrill finally wears off, she sets him down and says, "So tell me, why in all this time have you never said anything?" And he said, "Well, up to now, everything was okay." So I mention this because we tend to kind of go through life like this boy. You know, we notice the things that go wrong. We don't notice all the things that go right. And we're kind of hardwired for that to happen. I mean, it's part of the way the brain works. We kind of look for the negative unless we deliberately pay attention to the positive. So most of us have very little difficulty finding things to complain about, even if we're fairly happy and we know that our lives are generally pretty good. So we tend to overlook all the reasons we have for gratitude. When you read the instructions about cultivating the Brahma-Viharas, you come across concepts like gladness and appreciation quite frequently. And in fact, we're often reminded during the process of generating loving kindness and compassion for others to appreciate the good that lies within them. But when you get to the next step, mudita, that's where appreciation and gratitude really become important. So mudita, that's a Pali word. The Sanskrit word is very similar. And like metta, it doesn't really translate directly all that well. It's usually, if you see it translated, they'll use something like sympathetic joy, which isn't really very specific either. It's kind of vague. But the idea is that you're happy about another person's good fortune. So it's sort of unselfish or universal gratitude. The traditional phrase that you use when you're contemplating this, when you're chanting in a Theravada temple and you're chanting about mudita, is may all beings keep their good fortune. So it works on one level kind of as an antidote to jealousy and envy and things like that. And how do you usually feel when somebody that you don't like very much has good fortune? Usually a little bit resentful or maybe jealous or whatever. So when you cultivate this, you're happy for everyone's good fortune. There are 4 Brahma-Viharas: metta, compassion, mudita, and equanimity. And of the 4, I think this is probably the most overlooked. And they're all equally important, but you see a lot about loving kindness and metta. You see a lot about compassion. You even see a lot about equanimity. I went to a 10-day silent retreat once, and every question the teacher was asked, he answered, "Well, just have equanimity." So it comes up a lot, but nobody ever says, "Well, just have mudita." It just doesn't happen. So metta basically is the desire for happiness for oneself and others. So if I have metta for you, I want you to be happy. Compassion is the desire for others to not suffer. So if I have compassion for you, I want you to not suffer. So when you get good fortune, if I want you to be happy and I want you to not suffer, I'm glad that you have good fortune. Because basically I'm getting these things that I've cultivated, that I want. So when we're cultivating metta, we're doing a lot of kind of sending out these sort of, good wishes. When we're cultivating compassion, we're accepting suffering and we're sending out wishes for the end of suffering. So this is where we start to acknowledge that we do receive good fortune and kindness and compassion. So it's sort of recognizing that this kindness and compassion is a two-way street. I want you to be happy and not to suffer. I notice you're happy and not suffering. I'm grateful for your happiness. Make sense? Okay. So I use this word grateful. We've been working with Nikon a lot all the way through this process, noticing reasons that we have for gratitude. So we're cultivating gratitude when we do Nikon. We're cultivating gratitude when we do Mudita also, but it's more universal. I can be grateful for what I have. I can also be grateful for the good fortune you have. So it really multiplies exponentially your opportunities for gratitude. And you get to acknowledge that you're receiving. You see that kindness is a two-way process. So as we go through the meditation in a little while, we'll actually spend some time noticing that we're supported by others. We're supported by others' kindness and compassion. We'll get a little bit creative with this meditation when we do it. It's not 100% traditional, the way I'll talk you through it, but that's okay. If you study these things traditionally, you find there's a lot of variation. So, use this stuff as an opportunity for self-exploration, which means you don't have to have it etched in stone that you're going to do it in a certain way. Having said that, the main instructions that I turn to for how to do these things is the Path of Purification by Ajahn Buddhaghosa. And he says that to do this by starting with a good friend. So you know how when you do metta, you start by, may I be happy, and then you take a loved one. You say, may my mother, for example, be happy. And then a good friend, and then somebody that you know but you don't know really well, and then somebody you're having difficulty with, and finally all beings. So it's larger and larger expanding circles. And when we do Tonglen, the cultivation of compassion, we can start with ourselves, or we can start with somebody that we've recognized as suffering, and compassion arises naturally. And then we take that and we expand that out to loved ones and friends and neutral people and people we're having difficulty with and all beings. So when we do this, Buddhaghosa says, start with a good friend. And I think this makes a lot of sense. So I tend to work with it that way, and when I guide it with you in a little bit, we'll do it that way. And I think the reason is that when our friends have good fortune, we usually accept and appreciate that without too much complication. If your best friend gets a promotion or something like that, it's pretty easy to be happy for them. So you take that kind of gladness that arises from recognizing that your good friend has good fortune, and then you transfer that to these other widening circles of people and beings. And some interesting things can happen when you start doing this meditation. So one thing you can try is, if you've been working with the Nikon questions, when you think about these people as individuals, take a moment and ask the three questions. Right? The three questions are, what gifts have I received from this person? That's kind of a good way to get that sense of their goodness into your mind. And then, what gifts have I given? So you get a sense of the relationship. What trouble have I caused? That could come in pretty handy when you get to the difficult person sometimes, because we like to think about the trouble they cause us. We don't like so much to think about the trouble we cause them. But it's important to be aware of that. And then you notice some good things that they have, and you develop happiness because of their good fortune. Another interesting thing that will happen sometimes is that you'll be thinking of a friend or a loved one, and maybe you know that they've had some misfortune. Maybe they're going through a tough time. And so you're thinking, may they keep their good fortune. Well, they're going through a tough time. So this is a good thing. This is a good thing to recognize, and you can work with this. And I'll give you an example of how. When I was first preparing to lead a retreat, working through these things, I had just noticed a post from a friend of mine on Facebook, and a guy that I hadn't seen in a long time. He'd moved to California a long time ago, and it was his birthday or something. So I messaged him, and we ended up corresponding back and forth, and then I talked to him on the phone. And it turned out he had gone through a divorce, and he'd gone through a major business loss, and so a whole lot of upsets in his life. And he had left California and come to Winter Park and moved in with a friend and was, kind of hanging out in a friend's living room and all that kind of stuff, and dealing with depression, which he had a tendency to have, and all this kind of stuff. So he's going through a difficult time. So later that day, I was meditating, and I did this particular meditation, and I let him be the friend that came up. And so I started thinking, wow, he's having all this misfortune. But then you look and go, okay, well, misfortune doesn't last forever. And even when things are bad, things are still good. Okay? We still have a lot of good stuff going on, even if we're going through a tough time. And I started thinking about that with him. He had been depressed before. He knew he could survive depression. He knew what to do when he got depressed. Yeah, his wife had left him, but he had friends. I was being supportive. He had a friend who said, hey, come down to Winter Park and move in and don't worry about anything. He was actually exploring some new spirituality. He was going to the Buddhist temple down in Kissimmee and stuff like that. So he really had some good things going on in his life, even at this very difficult time. So when you encounter these kinds of people as you're going through this meditation process, you can bring that to that. And it'll happen with you too. We'll take an opportunity to cultivate some gratitude. And even if you're going through a difficult time, there's always people that are, well, not always. We are fortunate enough that we know that we have a spiritual community that's supporting us. And we've got teachings available to us, and nobody here looks particularly hungry. And we have basically what we need and then some.